We're very fortunate, therefore, today to have with us Radhika Alkazi, who has been working with persons with disabilities, particularly children with disabilities, for many, many years now. She's also the founder of Astha, which is an organization which works with families, particularly poor and vulnerable families who have children with disabilities in them. In addition to long years of work with this grassroots kind of organization, she has also recently established the Center for Research and Policy in Disability in order to bring the issues from the ground to the policy table as well and try and effect change from that level too. So today Radhika will be speaking to us about inclusive education for children with disabilities, with particular emphasis on the Right to Education Act and how that has or has not been able to address this problem sufficiently. She'll focus on a few states and also give us insights from the DICE data. So thank you, Radhika, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak a little bit at length about a subject that we don't normally talk about. I'm going to start with showing you a picture of this young girl. Her name is Tarannum, and she is in Karnataka. Now, Tarannum cannot sit up on her own, and when she does actually move, she rolls and she pulls herself up, and then she can come to the chowkhut of her house. And she's a very bright young woman, but unable to go to the school, which is about 100 steps away from her house. She's sitting here with her mother, and her mother, there's just been there's a new baby born in the family. The mother is unable to take Tarannum to school and bring her back. The teachers in the school are extremely worried about having someone like Tarannum with them in school because they won't know what to do. How is she going to sit? How will she go to the toilet? Who will look after her? And the last question, of course, is how will we teach her? But these other questions crowd in so much that this young girl has not gone to school. She's about 9 years old. And the question today is really why? And the first thing I'd like to really say to you today is I feel that the realization of the right to education with kids with disabilities is not so much about doing more of the same thing that we have been doing. It is really a question of the frameworks within which we try to realize this right. And I'm going to start with those frameworks because I do feel that those frameworks are not considered when we provision for the right to education of children with disabilities. We have been, what are our concepts? What are our concepts of, equality, of non-discrimination? What does inclusive education really mean? And these are questions. We use these words, but we don't often sit down together and address them, and I would make a plea for that really. The disability field has been lucky. We've had a very good international convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, 2007. India was the 7th country to ratify this convention. And what is important about this convention is that it gives you a totally different way of looking at disability, of understanding disability. And I think that's so important when we make provisions for kids with disabilities. What is that framework? I'll talk a little bit about it. The first thing really is that it talks about, who is a person with disability. Initially, like we would just say, persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments. And normally we stop at there. But the convention goes further and it says, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Now, in terms of provisioning for education, this means really that we're not only talking about the impairment of the child. You are talking about a whole lot of other factors, social, economic, political, cultural factors that impact that interact with the impairment of the child and prevent participation. Normally when we say children with disabilities, we don't think girl, we don't think Dalit, we don't think Muslim, we don't think Hindu, we don't think any of these things, we just think disability. So I think really the plea here is that that we need to look at who this child is, where this child is coming from, what are the contexts in which she and her family are living when we have to provision for education for this child, not just the impairment of the child. So that's the other point I would like to make. Equality and non-discrimination. The convention makes a very important point. It says that equality does not mean treating everybody with the same brush, but you cannot ignore differences when you are making provisioning, and specific needs of children must be met if we are to have any kind of equality. We've been to schools, we've been traveling quite a bit and gone to different schools, and very often principals turn around to us and say, oh, we treat every child equally. Yes, children with disabilities are with us, but we treat them equally, which means we don't change anything for them. We treat them equally. Now, the convention really says that is not equality. Equality means that we have to give reasonable accommodation. Now, this is a term which really, if you read the convention, you'll see this term that goes across the convention. And reasonable accommodation is really these small changes that you make that enable the child. For example, I may not be able to sit in a chair like this. I may need a chair with a support, and that's reasonable accommodation. So in a school, you may need to provide that for me. If you had provided that to Tarannum with a little bit of a belt here so that she could sit stably, she would have sat and she would have been in school. So reasonable accommodation are these little changes that you make at an individual level for the child. And that is extremely important to look at when we look at policy. Do we have provisioning for that kind of thing? The other thing that the convention says, and this is a principle of the convention. It says respect for difference and acceptance of disability as part of human diversity. So what the convention is really saying is that do not make this line between disabled child and the non-disabled child. That's an artificial line that we make. Because people are diverse. So you really have all kinds of diversity in this world, and we have to be able to recognize that and provision for all that diversity, and children with disabilities are one part of that diversity. Today in India, we are facing a big challenge, as you all know, to this whole concept of diversity. We are putting everything in kind of monolithic boxes and saying this is what India is, this is what nationalism is. It's the same thing. It's not very different. It's the same thing. You have to look at diversity and acknowledge diversity, and disability is just one part of that diversity. The convention widens our understanding of concepts. Education systems therefore have to provision for these things. Communication is not just the vocal communication that you and I are having just now. Language is not just spoken language. There is sign language. The communication talks about a whole host of things which constitute communication. Large print, for instance. There are children who may need larger print to be able to read the textbook, or plain language. Many of our intellectually disabled children will not understand difficult language. You need to simplify the language for that child. Or you may need somebody to read for me, or I may need to point out augmentative communication and alternative modes of communication. So really, what the convention does, it widens our understanding of these concepts, and therefore it is imperative that an education system must actually provision for this. And when it doesn't, that's when you get the exclusion. Accessibility is not just having a ramp in a school. It means access to infrastructure, information technology, outdoor, indoor facilities, urban areas, rural areas, and services. Accessibility applies to services, to information technology that we use in schools, and and also to private entities. Another big term that the convention uses is universal design. I think actually this is a very important concept for any kind of provisioning, because universal design is really design of services, products, environments, programs. You design them in a way that they are able to cater to all without making too many changes. And which does not mean that you don't make specific changes for specific people or for children, but your programming has to be such, your designing of education systems has to be such that everybody can be included. So universal design is a concept that comes from this convention, but I think needs to be used more universally by everybody. Then the principles of the convention, Article 3. Respect for evolving capacities of children with disabilities. You know, one of the things that happens with kids with disabilities is that we don't expect them to grow beyond a certain point. That is why we often throw them into things like home-based education or this education or non-formal or alternative, because we feel this child is not capable of learning further or evolving. And that is why the convention, this is a principle in the convention. It goes across the convention. The other big change that the convention makes is it talks about equal recognition under the law. You may be aware that people who live with mental illness and mental retardation or intellectual disabilities, when they become 18, they do not have the right to sign or the equal legal capacity under the law like you and I do. And one of the consequences of something like this is you don't expect enough from the child. You think this is a child with intellectual disability, ये क्या पढ़ेगा आगे, उसके लिए प्रोविजन करने की क्या ज़रूरत है, तो बहुत severely disabled child है, there is no need. But what the convention says is that everybody has equal legal capacity in the light of under the law. So people with intellectual disabilities, people living with mental illnesses should be able to take their own decisions about their lives. Therefore, we cannot, when people are young, put them away and say, this child can't go further or can't be educated. And that is why when you look at Article 24, which focuses on education, it talks about ensuring lifelong education. It makes a point here. The point here is that just like everybody, people with disabilities or kids with disabilities should have the right for lifelong education. So you don't stop at class 6 and say, bus, no more. You change your system. I'll just quickly run you through Article 24, the major things of Article 24. One of the things it says is, state party shall ensure an inclusive education system. Now, this inclusive education system is not just for the child with disabilities. We often talk about inclusive education as if it only pertains to disability. But what the convention is saying is that this is a systems issue. You have to actually create education systems that are inclusive. And in fact, if you read the thematic study on the right to education right of persons with disabilities to education, it goes further on and it says, inclusive education is today acknowledged as the most appropriate modalities for the states, is being increasingly recognized as the right to education is being increasingly recognized as the right to inclusive education. So, the question is whether we should only be talking in terms of right to education or whether now we should talk in terms of right to inclusive education for all children, including the child with disabilities. So that's a question, and that's something maybe we can talk about later. Then the Article 24 has many different things. Some of the more important thing is it talks about having education in the, the right to be educated in near the communities where you live. One thing that happens with kids with disabilities across the world has been that, state policies have often been such that children with disabilities have been, the moment a child is born, they are put into an institution away from their homes. Very often we think having hostels and, crowding kids with disabilities together in that hostel is the right answer. The convention therefore goes strongly against this whole concept of institutionalization and says right to education where you live. So that's another important thing that it says. Then it talks about, again, this is the article on education, and it's talking about reasonable accommodation for individual requirement. I want to underline this because without this you can't really do much for children with disabilities. Receive the support that is required within the general education systems to facilitate effective education. Effective individualized support measures are provided. So again, the individualized support measures become very important when we are talking about children with disabilities and their education. Then it talks about facilitating the learning of Braille, alternative scripts, augmentative and alternative modes and means and formats of education. I spoke to you earlier about the different kinds of communication. A system that does not provision for this cannot really be inclusive and cannot then say it is providing the right to education for children with disabilities. Promoting the learning of sign languages. And then it talks about particularly about blind and deaf-blind children, because you do need to change things for them, and it talks about how they should be educated in the best environments and that in the means of communication that they require should be used for their academic and social development. So I'll go further and now talk about what's happening in our country. As you know, education for children with disabilities has been divided traditionally between the Ministry of Social Justice, which deals with special schools, which is the nodal ministry for education of children, nodal ministry for just children with disabilities and people with disabilities. So this ministry looks at all your special schools and your aids and appliances, all the schemes for persons with disabilities. And then we have the Ministry of Women and Child Development, which has slowly tried to take more responsibility, at least on paper, for children with disabilities. But if you look at the ground and you look at things like ICDS or any other major scheme, you will see a deep exclusion of children with disabilities from these services. And these are early childhood services, extremely important for further education of the child. And that's why I'm pointing them out. And then you have, of course, the Ministry of Human Resource Development and the RTE. Now, the RTE, as you know, was amended in 2012. And in this amendment, apart from many other amendments, children with disabilities were included under the disadvantaged groups in the RTE. And there are the many clauses of the RTE, the ones on access, smaller PTRs, non-discrimination, no detention, CCE, special training, prohibition of corporal punishment and mental harassment. All these clauses can be interpreted extremely beneficially for children with disabilities. The question really is, have we done that? And my answer will be absolutely no. So we have a law which has the potential to include many children, but it's the way you interpret the law for different sets of children. I think we need to do this exercise for all children and for different sets of children. But when you look at the RTE and you look at official reports, you look at other reports on education, you feel that there's been really no interpretation of all these areas. For example, CCE, comprehensive evaluation can be very important for a child who may be very good at something else and not the academic part of it. So, but we are not thinking in those terms because we ourselves, I think, just are still grappling with many of these terms. Non-discrimination. One of the reasons why children with disabilities drop out of school consistently is the discrimination, both direct and indirect, that they face in education. So a law that has such a strong provision of non-discrimination should really have been able to benefit this child. But unfortunately, we've not developed those guidelines or thinking as to how really non-discrimination should happen for all children, including this child. Did the coming of the RTE change anything in the provisioning for the child with disabilities? No. The Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the way it happened, started in 2001, and the provisioning that it did for children with disabilities, that continued. And if you look at the provisioning of the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, because that is the tool through which RTE is supposed to be implemented, then what does it say for children with disabilities? It talks about survey, assessment, provision of assistive devices, networking, barrier-free access, which we have interpreted as ramps only, training of teachers, appointment of resource teachers, curricular adaptation, and home-based education. Many of these things. So the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan didn't address, for example, how sign language will be taught. The Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan doesn't address education of the child. It's much more the rehab, provide the assistive devices, so many camps will happen. And that is how the provisioning has been happening for years. And that's where our problem is. Because we've not actually looked at the law, interpreted it, and changed the provisioning to suit what the law says. Or what the convention says, which we have ratified. We are actually duty bound to do both. So we've been traveling around in a few states, and I'll just give you a quick thing. Actually, what's happening is the provisioning that has been there in some of the very good states like Karnataka is rolling back now. We are seeing a situation where there is a rollback in provisioning, in the very meager provisioning for children with disabilities. Now, Karnataka is a state which is known as the Mecca of disability because it has these huge old organizations, non-government organizations, and Karnataka is one of the few states that has a disability policy. It has a draft inclusive education policy. It's still a draft, it has not happened as yet, but it's a state that at least thought about it and has pushed and has that draft ready. It has, unlike other states, personnel at the ground level. These are not education personnel, these are personnel from the social justice part, but these are people at the ground level. You have village level rehabilitation workers who can who do a whole lot of provisioning for children and people with disabilities. So in a way, it is what you can say has been a good state. Karnataka did some very innovative things. It trained the general teacher to work with children with disabilities, inclusive education, resource teachers, and initially it had about 5 of these teachers at the block level, the 5 of the IERTs that they call, at the block level, to work, to train teachers, to train the other teachers, to look at home-based education, and to do a whole lot of planning and training for children with disabilities. But recently, what has happened is that the IERTs have been cut down, and we have now one teacher at your district level and we have 2 special educators at the block level. So from 5 you have 3 people now, and now they are at different levels. You can imagine, just imagine 2 people, 2 special educators who work on contract, 9 months contract, dealing with how many schools? How many schools in a block, roughly? Huh?
Few hundred maybe.
How do you deal?
10 or 20 or so.
Okay. So even if there are, say, so many schools, okay, there may be very few children with disabilities, but you have to actually travel to the schools, you have to train teachers. So the whole...
the different types of disabilities. Sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are so many different children. So you have this one teacher or 2 teachers that are supposed to actually deal with everything. And that's the provisioning we've had for years and years, and now it's rolling back. And now what has happened is that home-based education, which is something that I'm very against, but home-based education, the Karnataka used to have separate people, cadre of people dealing with home-based education. That has been cut out. And now these teachers are also charged with going to the homes of children. It's impossible. You cannot do it. So when you look at the JRMs, what are they saying? They are saying that there's total mayhem in the state. I won't go further, but similarly in Madhya Pradesh, we have again the same thing. These 2 teachers, mobile resource teachers, coordinators at the block level. And their tasks are so great. They have to deal with children in school, scholarships, training to general teachers. They are responsible for supporting children with disabilities from class 1 to class 12. And I ask you, can any teacher teach every child from class 1 to class 12? So that's the kind of provisioning that's happening in different states. Basically, the point I'm making, there's a rollback, there's a cutback, and there is an expansion of the roles of the few people that are supposed to be there, especially for children with disabilities. Okay, the Madhya Pradesh is a state that has also got a lot of hostels for children with disabilities. They are also facing budget cuts, unable to do activities that they are supposed to do. No training is given to the caregivers and personnel. Only children with mild disabilities are admitted to these hostels, which are run by non-government organizations largely. So that's the kind of provisioning that we've had in our states. Then we had the other provisioning that in 2012, when there was an RTE amendment, then home-based education was came under the RTE law. It was made a provision of the RTE. And since that provision, you have one line in the law that talks about home-based education, the choice of home-based education for children with multiple and severe disabilities. It's a choice. But today what is happening is, after that our rules didn't change, no guidelines by the central government, and officially by law home-based education has become another site for education. Now, this is something that I feel is not something for only disability activists to talk about, but it is something for educationists to discuss and to look at very carefully. Because if you can do it for one, you will do it for others also. How does this get implemented? Child is enrolled in the nearby school. Contrary to law, the state decides who goes into home-based education. None of the other provisions of the RTE apply. Yeah, all your other rights, the midday meal. You see study upon study about how important the midday meal has been for getting children into school and for retaining children in school. But in this home-based education, there's no midday meal that this child gets because the teacher just doesn't get there. At best, you will have somebody getting there once in 15 days, maybe for an hour. So the question that really we need to ask is this education? I would have felt better if the other ministry, our ministry, the nodal ministry had done this, and this was done for rehabilitation support. Going into the homes, understanding what kind of support the child needs, assistive devices, training in activities of daily living, not the education department. So my question really here is this education? Are we accepting the fact that this is education? And now with the way in which there has been a rollback in the states, you're not even getting there once in 15 days, once in a month, once in 2 months maybe, sometimes never. DICE does not collect data on home-based education, even though we see DICE going, trying to align with the RTE, there's no data. Often the government says home-based education will be used to prepare a child to go to school. But we have no data, there's no official data on how many children are actually prepared to go to school. Who does home-based education? It's your volunteers, your resource teachers, and people who have very little training, even less training than the teacher. These are the people that are supposed to actually work with children with severe and multiple disabilities. So that's another big question that is there. I'll quickly go through some of the major trends observed during some of our field visits. One, of course, is, government schools, and after the RTE, one thing has happened. Government schools don't say no to children with disabilities, but they don't welcome them either. They will in many ways tell you about the nearest special school. Here is this little boy who had just gone blind. He was going blind. He was in a hostel earlier and he was slowly losing his eyesight. The parents got him back to this village in Madhya Pradesh, and there is a school, government school right next doors. But nobody thought that this child could go to the government school because there was the thinking, how can a blind child go to a Sarkari school here? You have to go to a hostel or a special school. So that's the thinking that exists. Access. Access is a big issue for children with disabilities. Here are two little girls and one who is from Karnataka, Jayanti. She is just going to join class 1. She was there the day we went to the school. Wonderful, bright young girl again, but how will she come to school? Mother has to carry her to bring her to school. She can't walk on her own. Mother can't carry her every day and bring her. So we don't know whether Jayanti will actually get to school. Then here is Sakina, who lives in a rat pickers colony in Madhya Pradesh. Sakina recently lost her father. Now her mother works from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening. Sakina can't go to school because there's nobody to take her to school. Mother is worried if she goes to the school, will she be safe, because she can't see. She can't see very well. So the problems, why I'm illustrating this is that the issue is not only of impairment. Here is families where there is poverty involved, there is a lack of support within the family that is involved. There's only a single parent family that makes the family, any family, much more vulnerable. So these are the issues that children with disabilities also face. So we cannot only factor in a Braille book, we have to factor in all these factors when we talk about access to education for children with disabilities. Schools closing. In Madhya Pradesh, we heard again and again, schools are closing, government schools are emptying out. They were talking about schools with 10 children, 11 children. It's ironic that the states are making a big effort to fulfill the RTE norms of access. On the other hand, we are emptying out schools. Schools are emptying out. So your access norms are going to go backwards actually. When schools come together, when they are merged, then obviously you can't have a school at 1 kilometer. And that has a huge effect on children with disabilities, particularly all children. but particularly this child where access becomes a big issue. Like other parents, I thought that, our children, no, these will be the children who go to the government school, because we always say that the most marginalized will remain in the government school. But no, we were wrong, because parents of children with disabilities are saying we are sending their children, they're cutting their pate, and they are sending their children to the private school because they feel that their child will be better looked after. They feel that there will be some sunwai in that school. In some private schools, there are the support personnel. So if I can't walk, then there's somebody there to take me to the loo. So these little things and much more. So that's the other trend that we saw. No changes in schools. Nothing. There is no change that is made so that the child with disabilities can study in the school. So any child who requires personal assistance, if you go to any school, you will not see that child. If you go to any government school, you will not see a child who cannot walk on her own. You will see children with very mild disabilities, maybe one eye, or maybe, walking with a little difficulty. But anyone who needs personal assistance, it is either the parent who comes in the morning, at lunchtime, after take the child to the loo, or the child doesn't come in. And this happens right here in Delhi. So there are teachers. We met wonderful teachers in single teacher schools rather, who wanted to teach the child, but they felt that they had no training. And so that was really sad, because they said, हाँ वो आता है, वो हर रोज आता है. This was a hearing impaired child. वो आता है, वो बैठता है. Try my best to teach him, but I don't know what is reaching him. I don't know whether he's learning or not, because I can't see any output. Children with disabilities are struggling to keep up. So we see very often children with disabilities coming regularly to school, sitting in school, all neat with their uniform and everything, but they're just sitting in school. Now, day in and day out, to just sit in school is a very difficult task. So we are not seeing any changes made either in the way you teach, in your textbooks, in any guidelines. It's not such a difficult thing. You can actually put together a whole lot of guidelines, or sit and problem solve in your school. Okay, if this child can't go from one, how can we do it? It's not some rocket science, but we are not really doing it because we are not thinking about it. If you read the JRMs, JRM after JRM says these are official now, people going to look at the status of education in a state, but they don't see any evidence of the child with disabilities in the school. So that's another comment. And single teacher schools, of course, they feel, how do we teach this child now? As it is, we are teaching 5 classes. Now you want us to teach the child with disabilities. That's the question. Lack of rehab services. There is an intricate link between rehabilitation and education, particularly for this child. If you don't have rehab services at the ground and the child can't get it when they are very young, you will not be able to participate in education. This is a young hearing impaired child. He is going to school, but he is not hearing anything. His parents, the rehab facility or the hospital is far 30-40 kilometers away. So even if he gets fitted with a hearing aid, there's nobody to train him how to use the hearing aid. So unless you have these facilities close by, you cannot teach the child. He's going to school because he's in a small village. Everybody in the village knows the child. He's a lovely young child. He's going. He's there playing and everything. But is he learning? Will he come out? Will he be prepared for further life? Will we have given him a chance? No. School management committees. We understood as we went along to the various states, that the panchayats are very powerful also. And this whole relationship between the SMCs and the panchayats actually really needs to be looked at. But you see, what they are doing is they are echoing the sentiment of society. Panchayats don't feel children with disabilities can study in the school, or blind children. SMCs, there's been a lot of training of SMCs, but this aspect I don't think has been looked at, because they don't really feel that anything can happen. But we saw great opportunity at a village level, where there are ASHA workers, where there are Anganwadi workers. These people know everybody in the village. And I think that's a great opportunity, because they knew the disabled child in the village, but they didn't know how to take this further. So this is an opportunity that we need to capitalize on and have early childhood care, and then the child going into school. Parents, growing awareness for the demand of education. There is a growing awareness throughout the country. Parents will go to a great lengths to see their child is educated, but they are worried about the safety and security of their children. कौन मेरे बच्चे की देखभाल कौन करेगा? देखभाल is a word that is used often by parents of children with disabilities. If I am a child with vision impairment, if I have a child with vision impairment, I am worried कि वो गिरेगी स्कूल में, कोई बच्चा धक्का दे देगा. Now it's just a question of putting in systems, that's all. It's not even a question of the law. But my worry remains, because there's been nobody in the school who will actually care to do that. In our country, the full responsibility for the child with disability is thrust on the parent. Even the education system is not taking that responsibility. When teachers tell a parent, you come and you take your child to the loo, because we don't have any personnel who's going to take your child to the loo. If a child can't eat by themselves, who's going to feed that child? Should the child not come to school, or should there be somebody in the school who can feed the child or teach the child to eat? Because that is a requirement of this child. So these are the big questions that we are not answering at all. In our country, what we have are strong parent associations, but they are largely urban and middle class, but we have very strong parent associations. Because of our situations in our government schools, unfortunately, very often our parents also feel that the general school is not the place for my child. I would rather send my child to a special school. What is working? After giving you this long pessimistic picture, some things are working. We have greater success when parents and schools are supported by disability organizations at the moment. Wherever you see an organization and it's supporting, it's doing 1,000 things. It's preparing the child, it's supporting the parent, it's giving information, it's helping the teacher. That's where you see the success. So very important to study that actually and see what are the things that these organizations are doing, because actually they need to be part of the system. We have strong parent groups. Wherever there are disabled people's organizations and they are pushing for education, it's a little better. Greater success where management and principals, we always focus on the teacher, the poor teacher, and teachers training. But you have to look at the whole administration. Your success is when your whole administration is accepting this child, not just the teacher. Quickly run you through the last part of my talk, which is on the data. Data on disability in our country is very confusing, because you have the census data, you have DICE data, and they don't, we don't have the same disabilities that we look at in census and in DICE. So you can't really compare. So DICE data actually, it has data on children with learning disabilities and speech disability, which are not actually part of the legal definition of disability in our country. And census, the 2011 census, has this time taken on many more categories of disability. And the other big question is the questions that you ask. How do you actually say that this is a person with disability? So these are very different in the way DICE does it and census. DICE is done by teachers who are supposed to say this is a child with cerebral palsy, autism, hearing impairment, low vision, learning disability. So that's something. Anyway, we have about 65 lakh, not a large number. I would contest this number, but let's look at it just officially and say, are we doing justice to this? About 65 lakh children with disabilities in the 5 to 19 age group in our country. Actually, the number has come down from 2001 to 2011 census of this age group, the 5 to 19, but disability itself has grown marginally from the 2001 to 2011 census. We are seeing a shift to the urban areas where there is a decadal shift, although large numbers still remain in the rural areas. And you see that very interesting in this different kinds of disabilities. If you look at the census 2001 and 2011, you see big shifts again in, seeing, for example, vision impairment is coming down, although I don't know whether one can say that because it's difficult to compare the two censuses also. But basically that's what we are seeing. There are big shifts in the kinds of disabilities we are seeing. This is very important because you need to then know what to provision for. So if in 2011 census you are actually seeing 19% is hearing impairment, then your education system needs to provision for that. And that, I think, is unfortunately something that we are not probably really looking at. Enrollment. For 10 long years and more than that, the enrollment of children with disabilities, the percentage of enrollment in relation to total enrollment according to DICE was less than 1%. 2012 and 13 it jumped up. It came up to 1.118. This was also the year that DICE started enumerating more disabilities. It started looking at the cerebral palsy, autism, learning disability and multiple disabilities, which it didn't do earlier. But in 2014 and 15, we are seeing a drop again. So from 25 lakhs, it's come down to 23 lakhs, which is a fall. And if you look at the states, you will see that there is a fall in 23 states in 2014-15. And I think that's a red mark. It's a red flag for us to look. My understanding is that it's probably due to the fact that there has been a cut in provisioning over the years. And maybe we are seeing it now. Maybe it's too early to say. But this is what you're seeing. You're seeing 23 states. About 15 of these states have slipped below the 1% mark. So less than 1% in relation to total enrollment. Girls with disabilities doing very badly, really badly. So girls, 74.74. That's your GPI for girls in elementary education for girls with disabilities. And it's kind of remained constant all through. There's a little variation here and there, and even then it's falling. So girls is something we really need to focus on, girls with disabilities. In our country, we've had so much push on girls education. We are constantly talking about it. But unfortunately, in that, we don't look at the girl with disability. And there's a need to push there now. If you look at the different levels of education, and you look at the percentage, just the percentage of children with disabilities at different levels, you see a steep fall from your elementary level to your higher secondary level. Of course, this happens for all children. But if you compare, say, data for tribal children or children from the scheduled caste and CWSN, you will see that this child is perhaps falling even more drastically than the most marginalized. Rural India. Our enrollment in rural is about 18 lakhs, a little more than 18 lakhs. And our enrollment in the urban is about 4 lakhs. And I'm a little confused here. Is this really real? When I saw it, I was not quite sure. But if this is true, it tells us where we should be focusing just now. It does not mean we don't focus on the urban areas, but out of school children. This is now data that's quite old, but it is your MHRD study that, and children with disabilities are 28.23. That's your out of school data. Of children with disabilities, it is children with multiple disabilities, mental disabilities that are really out of school. Children with cerebral palsy, these are the kids who are not faring well at all. And because of home-based education, many more have been shoved into not going to school. And that's a real pity. So finally, just want to end by this wonderful picture of these two little children sitting. Why I have this here is because I think, India is a land of great diversity. And just as this child is one part of our diversity, so is the child with disability. And we are forgetting that. So in the larger discourse, I feel it's very important. Let's not go one child, child by child, disability, Let's try and integrate them all together and look at their specific requirements. Because only then, let the whole system integrate all children. Because if you only have, say, 2 mobile resource teachers and a little bit, this is for the child with disabilities, you'll never get inclusion. Unless right from there to the ground level you have an integration. And I want to argue today that it should not only be for this child, but we should put together all children and see how the system can become more inclusive. Thank you.